This is a moment in Jewish history. I was editing a video for someone about the Torah Parsha, and he asked me to add images of biblical figures, but try and make them look Jewish. So I searched for Jewish and Israeli artists, and I found what I thought were authentic, really Jewish-looking art by Jewish artists from Israel. But the person I was working with said, you know what, they just don't look Jewish. But what does that mean? What did Abraham look like anyway? And what exactly is Jewish art? Well, that's a question that many of the early Zionists thought about as well. Back in Europe, Jews weren't really allowed to join the guilds or own land or just attend any art school they wanted, or any school for that matter. And eventually that changed with Jewish emancipation in many countries in Europe. When the Zionist movement began, many Jewish artists saw the land of Israel as a place where they could practice art and explore their Jewish identity unrestricted. One of these artists was E.M. Lilien. He's the guy that took the famous old photo of Theodor Herzl leaning over the balcony in Basel, Switzerland during the Zionist Congress of 1901, deep in thought, perhaps contemplating his dream of creating a Jewish state in the land of Israel. I had a friend who traveled to Basel recently, and like many Israelis, he went to room 117 of the historic Les Trois Rois Hotel to recreate the famous photo. I once read an article about an Israeli elected official who came to the hotel and asked the desk clerk, a young woman, to see Theodor Herzl's room. She had no idea what he was talking about, so she went to research the back files and found an old logbook, to which she told him, "I'm sorry, sir, but this says Mr. Herzl has already checked out of the hotel." But who was E.M. Lilien, the artist who joined Herzl at the Fifth Zionist Congress back in 1901? That year celebrated several Zionist artists who not only wanted to revive the Jewish state, but to revive Jewish art. The book, The Art and Artists of the Fifth Zionist Congress, Heralds of a New Age, show examples of these works and how many in the Zionist movement sought to add a cultural aspect to their cause. Ephraim Moshe Lilien drew dramatic depictions of biblical figures, like an Art Nouveau-styled Moses holding the Ten Commandments, Abraham looking up at a starry sky. One drawing shows a Jewish man surrounded with barbed wire being directed by an angel toward Israel. Another similar piece shows an Ashkenazic Jewish man in tattered clothes leaving Egypt toward Zion. Another is called Allegorical Wedding and shows a merger between the Jews of the Bible, the exile, and a modern redemption. Lilien was born in Galicia, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. He studied art and moved to Germany, where he befriended the German Christian poet Boris von Münchhausen and illustrated his poetry book, Judah. Von Münchhausen supported the Zionist movement. He saw the Jews as a separate race, not European Germans like himself, and many Zionists were inspired by his poetry that re-envisioned biblical figures as Germanic heroes, but that eventually morphed into anti-Semitism. Von Münchhausen's ideas that Jews were a separate race without a land led him to become a Nazi, and he publicly supported Adolf Hitler and his ideas. But by that time, Lilien had already moved to the land of Israel, where he helped fellow artist Boris Shatz found the Bezalel Art School in 1906. Born in Lithuania, Shatz too depicted biblical figures. His idea of the Bezalel School was to train young talented Jews in fine arts as well as practical skills. Over 100 years later, the school is still active and recently opened a new building in downtown Jerusalem. I did a podcast on it last year where I interviewed graduating students. You can check that out on my website at benbresky.substack.com. Boris Shatz named the school after Bezalel from the Bible, the artist and craftsman who is tasked with building the Mishkan. A fellow artist depicted the modern-day Boris Shatz meeting Bezalel from the Bible. That artist was Ze'ev Raban, who was Bezalel's director of the graphics press and industrial art studio. He taught sculpture and helped design the King David Hotel in Jerusalem, as well as Torah arcs, Hanukkah menorahs, and other works. He also designed promotional posters for tourists to the land of Israel, and some of those posters, made back in the 1920s and 30s, are ironic today because they say in big letters, "Come to Palestine" and "Visit Palestine," which then advertise visiting the Western Wall, the Bezalel Art School, and other Jewish points of interest. The next art instructor at Bezalel I want to discuss is Abel Pann, because he is the one I discovered when trying to find the perfect representation of what biblical figures looked like, except Abel Pann's models for his figures were the Yemenite Jews he met in Israel. There weren't too many, if any, Yemenite Jews back in Europe, and his Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah look like what we would call today Middle Eastern, in exotic Mediterranean clothing. Did Abraham wear a turban? Did Pharaoh's daughter have curly hair? Abel Pann was born Abba Pepperman in the Russian Empire, the grandson of a rabbi. His art teacher was Yudel Pen, who depicted Jewish life in the Pale of Settlement and taught such famous artists as Marc Chagall. Pen was called the father of the Jewish art Renaissance. In 1937, Yudel Pen was murdered with an axe in his art studio. The circumstances remain shrouded in mystery, and it came during the era of Stalin's Great Purge in the Soviet Union. Marc Chagall eulogized him as his teacher, killed by an evil monster who took this old Rebbe somewhere to the other world. Marc Chagall's Bible illustrations are whimsical and imaginative. His famous Jerusalem stained glass windows depict the 12 tribes and are on display today at Hadassah Hospital. I like Chagall because he shows Abraham with a kippah. I'm not quite sure if Abraham actually wore a kippah, but that's how I imagine a Jewish artist would show a Jewish figure. And you can tell that these guys actually knew something about Judaism, and they probably attended a yeshiva class or two by the way they depict Jewish figures. But with Marc Chagall, I'm not sure if Moses had a green face, but that's just up to the interpretation of the artist trying to create an emotion. You know, not all of the artists who depicted Jewish-looking figures were Jewish. A case in point was the famous Dutch painter Rembrandt, who lived in the 1600s. In addition to his Christian works, he made many Jewish works. But I'm not sure that his Queen Esther and Ahasuerus look Persian to me. They look kind of Dutch. However, his famous 1635 painting, The Feast of Belshazzar, has the famous writing on the wall, as described in the book of Daniel, and it's written in Hebrew vertically. Now, only someone who had studied the Talmudic interpretation of the Daniel story would know that the Jewish sages explained that the reason the Babylonian wise men could not interpret the words on the wall was because they were written vertically. Rembrandt lived in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, and he had befriended many Jewish people, so they probably taught him that Gemara. Another non-Jewish artist I found quite useful in showing Jewish-looking biblical figures is James Tissot, the French painter who made many visits to Jerusalem in the late 1800s. I once even came across a bench on the edge of Jerusalem overlooking a valley with a plaque stating that James Tissot sat there and painted. His Moses and Aaron really look like Moses and Aaron, with their long flowing robes and beards and tunics and head coverings. At least the guy I did the video for told me that the James Tissot paintings looked more Jewish than the Abel Pann ones, which were more imaginative. In fact, James Tissot's Hebrew Bible collection is now on display at the Jewish Museum in New York. But getting back to Jerusalem's Bezalel School of Art, not all the students and teachers there were refugees from European shtetls. Some were born in Israel to Sephardic families, like Moshe Castel. For generations, the Castel family lived in Hebron, where they arrived after the Spanish Inquisition forced them out of Castile, Spain. He learned at Bezalel under Boris Shatz, and went on to paint scenes and people of Hebron, Jerusalem, and more abstract, colorful pieces as well. Speaking of abstract, colorful artists from Hebron, I would like to close with a modern artist, the late great Baruch Nachshon of Hebron. I was surprised and honored to find out that back when I hosted a music radio show, he was actually a fan and was listening to me. His colorful, detailed artwork shows Israeli cities and landscapes. Born in Haifa, Nachshon was one of the first to repopulate the Jewish quarter of Hebron after the Six-Day War. But that's a story for another time. Feel free to look up the artists I mentioned and let me know which ones you would use if someone asked you to make a video of the Patriarchs and Matriarchs for this week's Torah portion. But with art, it's up to the artist's interpretation and imagination. After all, we didn't have any photographs to see what they really looked like. This has been a moment in Jewish history. My name is Ben Bresky, and for questions and comments and past shows, you can check out benbresky.substack.com. Thank you to all the listeners, and Shalom.